The moon hung like a silver coin against the vast Arizona sky, casting long shadows across the weathered landscape of the Sonoran Desert. In the distance, the silhouette of the Superstition Mountains stood guard over the endless expanse of sagebrush and prickly pear. The air carried the crisp bite of autumn, 1885, and the faint scent of mesquite smoke from distant settlements. Ayanna pressed her small body against the rough wooden planks of the barn, her heart beating so loudly she was certain it would give her away. At 12 years old, she had learned to move like the desert wind itself, silent, purposeful, and nearly invisible. Her dark hair, braided with strips of leather, fell across her shoulder as she peered through a gap in the weathered boards. Inside the barn, sacks of grain and dried corn stood stacked like sentinels in the moonlight. Her stomach clenched with a familiar ache, not just her own hunger, but the memory of her younger brother's gaunt faces that morning. Takoda, only 8, had tried to hide his weakness, but she'd seen how his hands trembled as he gathered kindling. Little Nalnish, barely 5, had stopped asking for food altogether, his large, dark eyes growing more hollow each day. The ranch house beyond the barn sat dark and still. She'd been watching the place for 3 weeks now, studying the patterns of the man who lived there alone. He rose before dawn, tended to his small herd of cattle, and returned to the house as darkness fell. By now, he would be asleep, lost in whatever dreams haunted men who chose solitude over society. Ayanna slipped through the loose board she'd discovered on her first scouting mission. The barn smelled of hay and leather, with the underlying musk of horses and cattle. She moved with practiced efficiency, knowing exactly where to step to avoid the creaky floorboards. Her fingers, nimble from years of gathering herbs and berries with her grandmother, quickly untied the top of a grain sack. She filled the small leather pouch at her waist with dried corn, taking only what she needed, enough to keep her brothers alive for another few days, but not so much that the loss would be immediately obvious. This was survival, not greed, a distinction her grandmother had taught her before the fever took her last winter. As she prepared to leave, her foot caught against something in the darkness. A small tool clattered to the ground, the sound echoing through the barn like a gunshot. Ayanna froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. She waited, counting her heartbeats, listening for any sign that the sound had awakened the rancher. The night remained still. Moving even more carefully now, she retrieved the fallen tool and placed it where she'd found it. Then, like a shadow dissolving at dawn, she slipped back through the loose board and into the desert night. The 3-mile journey back to the hidden canyon, where she'd made a shelter for her brothers, felt longer than usual. Every sound, the rustle of a rabbit through the brush, the distant howl of a coyote, made her start. But she knew these sounds, understood their meanings. They were the language of her homeland, speaking to those who remembered how to listen. The canyon offered them protection from the harsh desert winds and concealment from the cavalry patrols that still swept through the territory, searching for Apache who'd refused to surrender to the reservation system. Ayanna had watched her entire world crumble over the past 2 years. First the battles that scattered their band, then the disease that claimed most of the adults, including their parents, and finally the harsh winter that took their grandmother. She found her brothers huddled together beside the dying embers of their carefully concealed fire. Takoda's eyes opened immediately as she approached. He'd developed the same hypervigilance that kept them all alive. "Did you find food, sister?" he whispered in Apache, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility no 8-year-old should bear. Ayanna nodded, pulling out the pouch of corn. "We'll eat in the morning. Rest now." As she settled beside her brothers, pulling the worn blanket over all 3 of them, she allowed herself a moment of relief. They would survive another day. But as she stared up at the stars through the canyon's narrow opening, she couldn't shake the feeling that their luck was running thin. The rancher's ranch was the only source of food for miles, and eventually he would notice the missing supplies. What would happen then? Thomas McKinnon woke to the familiar ache in his left shoulder, a permanent reminder of Gettysburg and the choices that had brought him to this isolated corner of Arizona territory. The pre-dawn air was sharp and clean, carrying none of the smoke and screams that still visited his dreams. He'd come west, seeking silence, and in the vastness of the desert, he'd found something close to peace. At 42, Thomas had grown comfortable with solitude. His weathered hands moved through the morning routine with methodical precision, checking the horses, examining the fence lines, counting his small herd of cattle. The ranch wasn't much to look at, but it was his, bought with his army pension and built with his own 2 hands. It was while checking his grain supplies that he first noticed something amiss. The corn sack, which should have lasted another 2 weeks, seemed lighter than it had been just days before. Thomas frowned, lifting the sack and gauging its weight. He'd grown up on a farm in Ohio before the war. He knew grain, knew its weight and volume with the instinct of someone who'd counted every kernel during lean times. His initial thought was rats, but there were no droppings, no chewed corners on the sacks. He examined the barn more carefully, his trained eye, sharpened by years of military reconnaissance, taking in details he'd previously missed. There, in the dust near the loose board he'd been meaning to repair, he found it, the faint impression of a small, bare foot. Thomas knelt beside the print, studying its size and depth. A child's foot, certainly, but the way the toes gripped the earth spoke of someone accustomed to moving silently across rough terrain. This wasn't some settlement child playing pranks. This was someone desperate enough to risk stealing from a man who might shoot first and ask questions later. The discovery unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. In his 3 years on this ranch, he'd encountered only a handful of other people, traveling merchants, the occasional cavalry patrol, and once a small group of Mexican vaqueros driving cattle north. The isolation was what he'd sought, what he'd needed after the war. The idea that someone had been watching him, studying his patterns, made his skin crawl with unwelcome memories of enemy scouts and night raids. That evening, instead of retiring to the house as usual, Thomas positioned himself in the hayloft with a clear view of the barn interior. His old cavalry colt lay within easy reach, though something about that small footprint made him hesitate to load it. He'd killed enough children during the war, boys barely old enough to shave, fighting for a cause they barely understood. The thought of adding another to that count made his stomach turn. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting the barn in silver light and deep shadows. Thomas had nearly convinced himself that whoever had been stealing from him wouldn't return, that his discovery of the footprint had somehow scared them off, when he heard it, the faintest whisper of movement near the loose board. He watched, hardly daring to breathe, as a small figure slipped through the gap. Even in the dim light, he could see that his thief was, indeed, a child. A girl, he thought, though it was hard to tell with her hair braided back and her clothes practical rather than decorative. She moved with a grace that spoke of someone born to the desert, every step calculated and silent. Thomas observed as she went directly to the grain sacks, taking only a small amount, enough to fill what looked like a leather pouch at her waist. There was no greed in her actions, no wastefulness. This was someone who understood scarcity, who took only what was absolutely necessary. When she finished and prepared to leave, Thomas faced a choice that would define everything that followed. He could remain hidden, let her go, and simply accept the small losses. He could confront her, demand answers, risk scaring her into running where he might never find her again. Or he could follow her, learn where she went and why she was stealing food in the first place. Something about her careful movements, the way she gently repositioned items to hide evidence of her presence, made him choose the third option. After she disappeared through the loose board, Thomas waited several minutes before climbing down from the loft. He moved to his bedroom window, watching as the small figure headed northwest into the desert. Once she was far enough away that his movement wouldn't alert her, he slipped out of the house. Following someone at night across desert terrain was dangerous work, especially when that someone clearly knew the land better than he did. But Thomas had learned tracking from Apache scouts during his army days, men who could follow a trail across solid rock and read stories in the bend of a broken twig. He kept his distance, using the moonlight and his quarry's occasional silhouette against the horizon to maintain contact. The trail led through a landscape of towering saguaro cacti and ancient rock formations, country that looked hostile in the silver light. Thomas had explored some of these canyons during his first year on the ranch, but never this far north. The girl moved through the terrain as if she'd been born to it, never hesitating at game trails or false paths. After nearly an hour of careful tracking, she disappeared entirely. Thomas waited, scanning the moonlit landscape for any sign of movement. It was as if the desert had simply swallowed her. He moved forward cautiously, trying to read the trail in the pale light, but the rocky ground revealed nothing. Then, from somewhere ahead, he heard it, the soft murmur of voices speaking in Apache. His blood chilled. Apache. The word carried weight in Arizona territory, conjuring images of Cochise and Geronimo, of cavalry charges and burning settlements. Thomas had fought alongside Apache scouts, had learned to respect their skills, but he'd also seen what happened when negotiations failed and warfare erupted. As he crept closer to the sound, moving from shadow to shadow among the rock formations, Thomas began to make out individual voices. The girl he'd followed was speaking quietly to what sounded like younger children. Her tone was gentle, reassuring, the voice of someone trying to calm fears and offer comfort. The realization hit him like a physical blow. These weren't raiders or scouts. These were children, hiding in the desert, surviving on what little they could steal or scavenge. The girl he'd followed wasn't a thief in any meaningful sense. She was trying to keep her family alive. Thomas retreated carefully, his mind racing as he made his way back to the ranch. The simple equation of theft and punishment had become something far more complicated. These children were clearly on their own, living without adult protection in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They were taking food not out of greed or malice, but out of the most basic human need, survival. As he reached his ranch house and settled into his kitchen chair, Thomas stared out at the desert and tried to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. The war had taken much from him: his innocence, his faith in simple solutions, his ability to sleep peacefully through the night. But it had also taught him something about the weight of choices, about the moments that defined a person's character. He thought about the girl's careful movements, the way she'd taken only what she needed, the gentleness in her voice as she spoke to the younger children. These weren't enemies, these were survivors, doing whatever was necessary to see another dawn. The question was, what was he going to do about it? 3 days after discovering the trail, Thomas made his decision. Instead of waiting to catch the girl in his barn, he would go to her. The journey to the canyon took longer in daylight, partly because he was moving more carefully, partly because he was carrying supplies. His saddlebags contained dried meat, beans, a small sack of flour, and medical supplies, everything he could think of that hungry, isolated children might need. His rifle remained in its scabbard on his horse, within reach, but not in his hands. This wasn't a raid or an arrest, it was something else entirely, though he wasn't entirely sure what. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, revealing details the moonlight had hidden. Thomas could see where flash floods had carved channels through the rock, where generations of wind had sculpted the sandstone into fantastic shapes. It was beautiful country, he realized, harsh and unforgiving, but beautiful in its own way. Finding the canyon entrance in daylight proved easier than he'd expected. The girl's trail was still visible to his trained eye, and the natural formation created an obvious landmark. As he approached the narrow opening, Thomas dismounted and ground-tied his horse. Whatever happened next, he wanted his hands free and his movements non-threatening. The canyon was deeper than he'd imagined, its walls rising 30 feet on either side to create a natural shelter from wind and rain. Scraggly cottonwoods grew near what must be a seasonal water source, and the remains of several fires indicated the space had been used as a temporary camp for some time. Thomas had taken perhaps 20 steps into the canyon when she appeared. The girl materialized from behind a boulder as if the rock itself had taken human form. Her dark eyes were wide with alarm, but there was no panic in her stance, only the coiled readiness of someone prepared to fight or flee depending on the situation. In her hand, she gripped a knife that looked too large for her small fingers, but Thomas had no doubt she knew how to use it. "Stay back," she said in accented but clear English. Her voice was steady despite her obvious fear. "I have nothing you want." Thomas raised his hands slowly, palms open. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice calm and level. "My name is Thomas McKinnon. I live on the ranch you've been visiting." Her eyes darted toward the canyon's entrance, calculating distances and escape routes. "I don't know what you mean." "The corn," Thomas said gently. "From my barn. You've been very careful, very quiet, but I noticed." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the 20 feet of sandy canyon floor. Thomas could see the wheels turning in her mind, weighing options, assessing threats. This close, he could also see how thin she was, how her clothes, a mixture of Apache traditional dress and settler hand-me-downs, hung loose on her small frame. "Are you going to turn us in?" she asked finally. "To the cavalry?" The question hit Thomas harder than he'd expected. These children were afraid not just of him, but of the authorities who would likely force them onto a reservation, separating them from the only life they'd known. The girl's use of "us" confirmed his suspicion that she wasn't alone. "No," he said, "I'm not going to turn anyone in." "Then what do you want?" Thomas gestured toward his saddlebags, which he'd left with his horse at the canyon entrance. "I brought food, real food, not just stolen corn, and some medical supplies, in case anyone needs them." The girl's grip on the knife didn't waver, but something shifted in her expression. "Why?" It was a fair question, one Thomas had been asking himself during the entire ride. Why was he helping children who had been stealing from him? Why risk involvement in a situation that could bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities? "Because you remind me of my sister," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. The admission hung in the desert air between them. Thomas rarely spoke of his family, of the life he'd left behind in Ohio. But there was something about this girl's fierce protectiveness, the way she'd positioned herself between him and whatever lay deeper in the canyon, that brought back memories of Sarah at the same age, always standing up to schoolyard bullies, always ready to fight for what she believed was right. "Your sister?" the girl asked, curiosity momentarily overriding caution. "She died during the war," Thomas said simply. "Typhoid, while I was fighting in Virginia. She was about your age, and she had the same look in her eyes, like she was ready to take on the world if it meant protecting the people she loved." The girl studied his face, searching for deception. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she lowered the knife slightly. "My name is Ayana," she said, "and we're not thieves, we're just trying to survive." "I know," Thomas said. "How many of you are there?" Ayana hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. My two younger brothers, our parents and grandmother are dead. The cavalry scattered our band 2 winters ago, and most who weren't killed were taken to the reservation. We hid." The simple statement carried enormous weight. These children had been living on their own for 2 years, surviving in the desert through 2 winters, avoiding capture by forces specifically searching for Apache who'd refused to surrender. The fact that they were still alive spoke to remarkable resilience and skill. "Your brothers," Thomas said. "Are they sick? Injured?" "Hungry," Ayana replied bluntly. "Always hungry. And Nalnish, my youngest brother, he has a cough that won't go away." Thomas nodded toward the canyon entrance. "I have medicine, food that will last longer than stolen corn. Let me help." "Why should we trust you?" she asked, though her tone suggested she wanted to. "Because I'm asking, not demanding," Thomas said, "and because I know what it's like to lose everyone you care about." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the canyon walls. Finally, Ayana made a decision that would change all their lives. "Takoda," she called in Apache. "Nalnish, come meet the man from the ranch." 2 smaller figures emerged from deeper in the canyon. The older boy, perhaps 8, approached cautiously, but with the same dignity his sister displayed. The youngest, clearly the one with the cough Ayana had mentioned, hung back until his sister beckoned him forward. Thomas knelt to bring himself to their eye level. Up close, he could see the toll their harsh life had taken, the hollow cheeks, the 2 bright eyes of chronic hunger, the wariness that came from never feeling safe. But he could also see their strength, the unbreakable bond between the siblings. "I'm Thomas," he said, "and I'd like to help, if you'll let me." The youngest boy, Nalnish, stepped closer to his sister and whispered something in Apache. Ayana responded quietly, then looked back at Thomas. "He wants to know if you have any stories," she translated. "About your sister." The question caught Thomas off guard. In all his preparations for this encounter, he hadn't expected to be asked about Sarah. But looking at these children, orphaned, isolated, clinging to each other for survival, he found himself wanting to share those memories. "Many stories," he said. "Would you like to hear them while we eat?" For the first time since he'd entered the canyon, Ayana smiled. The arrangement began tentatively, built on careful trust and mutual need. Thomas would bring supplies to the canyon twice a week, always announcing his arrival from a distance and always coming alone. In exchange, the children allowed him into their hidden world, sharing stories of their grandmother's teachings and their memories of life before the wars scattered their people. Over the course of several weeks, Thomas learned their full story. Their father had been a warrior who died fighting the cavalry near Apache Pass. Their mother succumbed to fever the following winter, along with most of the adults in their small band. Their grandmother, a medicine woman named Maria, had kept the 3 children alive for another year before she, too, fell ill. "She made us promise," Ayana explained one afternoon as they shared a meal of beans and cornbread. "Promise we would stay together, stay free, stay Apache. She said the reservation would kill our spirits, even if it didn't kill our bodies." Thomas understood the weight of such a promise. He'd seen reservation conditions during his army service, the overcrowding, the inadequate food supplies, the systematic destruction of traditional ways of life. For these children, their grandmother's dying wish wasn't just about survival. It was about preserving their identity, but winter was approaching, and Thomas knew their current shelter wouldn't protect them from the harsh desert cold. More importantly, little Nalnish's cough was worsening, and Thomas suspected it might be developing into something more serious. "There's a cabin," he said one evening as they sat around their small fire, "about a mile from my ranch house, back in the foothills. It was built by the previous owner but never finished. I could fix it up, make it weatherproof. You'd still be free, still be yourselves, but you'd be warm and safe." The suggestion sparked an intense discussion between the siblings in rapid Apache. Thomas caught only fragments, but he could hear the conflict in their voices, the desire for security warring with their fear of losing independence. "What would we have to do?" Dakota asked finally. "What would you want from us?" Thomas had been thinking about this question for days. "Help around the ranch when you're able. Ayana already knows more about desert plants and weather patterns than I ever will. Dakota, you could help with the horses. They respond to you better than they do to me. And Nalnish, well, he could focus on getting better and being 8 years old." "You want to hire us?" Ayana asked, surprised. "I want to offer you a place to belong," Thomas said. "Not as servants or prisoners, but as family, I suppose." The word hung in the desert air like a challenge. Family. For Thomas, who'd lived alone for 3 years, who'd convinced himself he preferred solitude to the complications of human relationships, it was a terrifying prospect. For the children, who'd lost everyone they'd ever loved, it was equally daunting. But Nalnish's cough made the decision for them. That night, as the temperature dropped and the little boy's breathing became more labored, Ayana looked across the fire at Thomas with tears in her eyes. "If we come with you," she said, "will you let us stay together?" "Always, always," Thomas promised. The next morning, they packed what few possessions the children had salvaged and made the journey to Thomas's ranch. The abandoned cabin sat nestled against a hillside, its stone foundation solid, but its walls incomplete. With the children's help, Thomas spent the next 2 weeks finishing the construction, installing a proper fireplace, and making it into a real home. Ayana proved invaluable in choosing the right location for a vegetable garden and identifying edible plants throughout the surrounding area. Dakota, despite his young age, had an intuitive understanding of horses that amazed Thomas. Even little Nalnish, once his cough began responding to the medicine Thomas had brought from town, showed himself to be remarkably bright and curious about everything from ranch work to the books Thomas had accumulated over the years. The first real test of their new arrangement came 6 weeks later when a cavalry patrol rode up to Thomas's ranch house. Thomas met them outside, his heart hammering, but his expression calm. "Afternoon, Lieutenant," he said to the young officer leading the patrol. "What brings you out this way?" "We're looking for Apache fugitives," the lieutenant replied, dismounting from his horse. 3 children, possibly siblings. They were spotted in this area several weeks ago. Thomas kept his expression neutral, though internally he was calculating distances and escape routes. "Haven't seen any Apache children," he said truthfully. At that moment, all 3 children were inside their cabin, hopefully hidden from view. The lieutenant studied Thomas's face, looking for signs of deception. "Mind if we look around? Check your buildings?" "Of course," Thomas said, gesturing toward the barn, "though I should warn you, I've been having trouble with rats. Might be best if your men stay mounted." As the patrol searched the ranch, finding nothing, of course, Thomas engaged the lieutenant in conversation about territorial politics and the ongoing Apache campaigns. It was a careful balancing act, appearing cooperative while deflecting attention from anything that might lead to the cabin. After an hour, the patrol prepared to leave. As they mounted their horses, the lieutenant turned back to Thomas. "If you do see anything, McKinnon, you're obligated to report it. Harboring fugitives is a federal offense." "Understood," Thomas replied. "But like I said, I haven't seen any Apache children." After the patrol disappeared over the ridge, Thomas walked quickly to the cabin. He found all 3 children inside, Ayana standing protectively in front of her brothers, a rifle, Thomas's spare, in her hands. "Are they gone?" she asked. "They're gone," Thomas confirmed, "but they'll be back eventually." We need to be more careful. Over the following months, they developed routines and safeguards. The children learned to recognize the sound of approaching horses from a distance, and they practiced hiding in the cave system Thomas discovered in the hills behind the cabin. More importantly, they worked together to create a life that honored both their Apache heritage and the necessities of their new situation. Thomas picked up basic Apache, while the children improved their English. Ayana taught him to track and find medicinal plants, and Takoda, a natural with horses, learned ranching from Thomas. Fully recovered, Nalnish became their sharp-eyed scout. One evening on the porch, Ayana asked, "Do you ever regret taking us in?" Thomas paused. Life had been simpler alone, but not fuller. "No," he said. "This feels like my first real home since before the war." Ayana smiled. "Grandmother said family isn't just blood. It's choosing to stand together when the world pushes you apart." "She was wise," Thomas replied. "She'd have liked you," Ayana added. "She believed the best people help without expecting anything back." As stars filled the sky, Thomas thought back to that night he'd followed footprints into the desert. He had sought solitude, but found purpose and hope. The children had healed him more than he'd healed them, teaching him that family can be chosen and that true courage is opening your heart after loss. In the distance, a coyote howled, but within their warm circle, 4 people, once strangers, now shared something stronger than blood. They were home,